Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you another science fiction fantasy wrap up. This time I'm talking about a whole bunch of new books. Several of them are new favorites. And if you can hear it in my voice, yes, once again, I am so sick. So stamp it on your bingo card. How many times have I recorded videos when I'm under the weather? So give me a little bit of grace if I'm a little bit more fragmented on camera in terms of having to start-stop so you don't hear me cough. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about Hopeland by Ian McDonald, and this is a book that I was very excited to receive for review because it was one of my most anticipated releases for the year. In the story, we follow a family. This is a family epic, but also a piece of science fiction and fantasy, and it's also a love story. Essentially, we follow a young woman who is trying to become the next electromancer in London, and the story is great in scope. It has, as I mentioned, a romantic element to it, and it just sounded incredibly unique. I wanted to read this author for quite a while, and I gotta say that while I went into this book with high expectations, this book did not really work for me. There isn't anything I per se would say is wrong with the book other than the fact that despite it being technically everything that I described here, it didn't really connect with me on any emotional or intellectual level that I was excited about this book. I wasn't interested to go back to it. When I hear about a family epic, I want to be like lost in a story and get really connected to the characters, and perhaps that's the greatest flaw. The fact is that I just didn't really care for the characters, and because of that, their relationships, their lives became less important to me. Needless to say, I'm still interested in reading this author's backlist. I believe they have a book, either New Moon or Lunar Moon, that is very beloved, and I think that one will be more up my alley because this one again is a blend of speculative fiction, while that one is just straight science fiction, which more likely will be to my taste. Next up, I want to talk about the Titanic Galaxy. This is a book that I received for review from Libro FM. If you're looking for a new source for audiobooks, I do always have a link down below if you want to start a trial. But this is a piece of science fiction that is translated. This follows a young Japanese man who is going to college and is unfulfilled in his life, and basically gets the opportunity to live his life in different parallel realities and get to see what would happen if he took different paths in life. As a premise, this sounded amazing. I was very excited for it, and a lot of the early reviews had said that while of course this is a book, in a lot of ways it reads like a novel form of an anime, which sounded right up my alley. And as you can kind of tell from the way I'm talking, I didn't love it. In fact, I really hated it. And the main problem for me was the main character, who was so unlikable. I hated him, and I do feel like it was almost purposely done that he was meant to be a little bit unlikable. But he was so unlikable. I didn't like him in any of his realities. And I think the problem with a book with a premise like this is that you want to root for the character. You want them to find happiness. You want them to find fulfillment. I just wanted him to go away. So it made the premise of the book just didn't really fit with the kind of character that we were presented. I have no problem with unlikable characters if we're meant to hate them, but I felt like we were meant to root for the underdog. But needless to say, I did not like this book, I did not like this character, and I can't recommend it. I do, in fact, like the Libro FM audiobook service, but the book, not so much. Next, let's talk about happier things, and I received a copy of Lost in the Moment and Found by Sean McGuire. This is the latest book in the Wayward Companion series, and this is a fantasy novella, and one that I was really excited to check out. In this story, we follow a young girl who right at the beginning of the story, her father passes away suddenly, and her mother goes on to remarry another man. However, she never feels quite right around this man. She doesn't feel comfortable with him, and soon enough he starts to gaslight her, and just bad things start to happen within their home, as you can imagine in the situation. And because this is a portal fantasy story, eventually this girl finds an opportunity to escape her life and go somewhere else, in which case she falls into the Wayward series universe. Now, this is a book that I requested specifically because of the framing of the story. I am fascinated by stories that involve childhood abuse and gaslighting, and while these topics are certainly difficult to read, I will note that the author did a very good job of handling these very sensitively and having warnings at the beginning of the book, so you go into this book knowing exactly what to expect, and it was done as off the page as possible. But at the same time, the author did a great job of having an emotional pull for the character. I immediately felt for this young girl and sympathized with her position and wanted the best for her. This is a series that I believe I read the first book when it first came out years ago, and I never continued on, and reading this book makes me really regret doing that. So after finishing this, I want to go back to the start and start all over again and catch my way up. But if you are like me and have not yet started this series, or I've only read the beginning of it, this book really does work as a standalone. I completely fell in love with it. I loved it so much. Again, I completely cared for the character, even though I didn't understand the larger picture. So in the later half of the book, when she goes through the portal, I am very much aware that I'm sure there are references and characters that would be more meaningful to me if I had read some of the previous books in the middle. But even without that knowledge, this book was so well done that I didn't need this to enjoy the book. I gave it 4 stars, and I just suspect that if I already had fallen in love with the entire series, this might be a 5-star read for me. So again, why I want to go and catch myself up. But I think, again, if you're a fan of the Wayward series, this one I suspect is one of the best. And if you're new to the series and want to start here, I definitely think you can do that. I don't think it's going to spoil anything that comes before. And I loved it. What a powerful story. What a harrowing story, and one that I cannot stop thinking about. Again, it's a very short book, but it left such a powerful mark on me, and I cannot recommend it enough. Next, let's talk about The Tyranny of Faith by Richard Swan. This is the second book in the Justice of Kings series. If you follow my channel, you might know that I absolutely love book 1. It was one of my favorite books published last year. And so needless to say, I went into this book with high expectations, and thankfully they did not disappoint in this case. If you are somehow unfamiliar with the series, it's going to be a trilogy, I believe. And in the first book, we follow a man who is the justice, jury, and executioner for the land. He goes about conducting the emperor's justice on the countryside, but the story is actually told from the perspective of his apprentice, Helena. And that, I think, was a brilliant choice because it makes our main character a bit more mysterious, because we do not see the story through his eyes and instead have to piece together what he is thinking and what his motivations are from the perspective of this young woman. I personally loved the first book, but I did hear other people say that they found Helena to be a little bit too innocent and naive in the first book. And so if that is a problem for you, I think that is really resolved in book 2. She has seen a lot more, and she has certainly grown as a character. I thought her character development in this one was fantastic. I cared very deeply for her, and I loved seeing her work through the challenges that were presented in this book. This book is very relationship and character focused, and there were some twists and turns and development that I personally loved. I can't talk about them without spoilers, but chapter 15 blew my mind. I was hoping that would happen, but I didn't expect it, so thank you for that. Otherwise, the basic plot of the second book, without giving away anything in the first, is that we follow them as they are looking for the grandson of the emperor who has disappeared, possibly kidnapped, and now they are trying to figure out where he is. And so I love the mystery of the story, which is very compelling and holds its own. But again, honestly, they could have a story with pretty much any plot at this point. I was so happy to spend time with the characters as they worked through their challenges and worked through their lives. So I was very content no matter what was happening in this series. In some ways, this book and the series is slower paced, but in other ways, I couldn't stop turning the pages. If I didn't say it before, I read this book twice, once as a physical book, and then the Orbit folks were able to hook me up with an audiobook review copy, and wow, I loved it even more the second time. So my voice is going, but needless to say, I adore this book. I hope more people check it out. And I just want to spend all day with Helena. I am dying to get my hands on book 3, but obviously we have to wait. Hopefully not too long, because this series definitely has all-time favorite potential at this point. Next, let's talk about Emperor of Ruin by Django Wexler, and this is another book that I received for review from Orbit. This is the third book in a now completed trilogy. If you want to start the series, you do want to go back to the beginning with Ashes of the Sun, but as always with my reviews, I'm going to keep this spoiler-free even if you haven't read the first book. So within the story, we follow 2 siblings who are pulled apart and end up being on different sides of an opposing war and divide, and both of them are trained in their own magic systems. And then of course you have them having to deal with the fact that there is a division between them, and we follow them within the stories. The first book I compared strongly to Star Wars because of a few things. One being the fact that it's very much centered around a set of twins or siblings, so you have that connection to Luke and Leia, which is very prevalent in Star Wars, but particularly the fact that one of the fighting styles that they're taught is very similar to lightsabers, and it definitely felt like the author got heavy inspiration from Star Wars in several of their plot choices, as well as the particular combat that they chose to invoke. So despite the series starting out with a lot of references similar to Star Wars, I'm happy to say that by the last book I really didn't see those comparisons that much, and by no means it did not read like Return of the Jedi. The plot has moved to other places, the characters have grown and developed, and it's very much its own story. In terms of fantasy, this one may not be a personal all-time favorite of mine simply because I prefer fantasy that is a little bit more epic or dark in scale that tends to become a personal favorite of mine, but I like this one in terms of enjoyable read. It was fun, it was enjoyable, it was fast-paced and action-packed, which again are what I'm looking for when I'm just looking to pick up something fun, but perhaps not the most memorable fantasy series I've ever read. But I don't think every fantasy series you read has to fulfill that particular criteria. So needless to say, I thought this was a strong conclusion. It brought everything together in a way that was perhaps predictable, but what I expected from the end of the series. So I do think if you enjoy the first two books, you will be pleased with where this one comes together in the end. Now, switching over to backlist fantasy, I want to talk about The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson. And this is a fantasy novella that I got an opportunity to review as part of the 10th anniversary. And this is a story that is technically set within the world of Elantris. And while I have read that one, I really don't feel like you need to read that one in order to enjoy the story. I'll be honest, I don't actually see the connections there. So someone who is a bigger fan of Sanderson, maybe explain in the comments how these books are technically related, because I don't get it. But as a standalone, I think this works fantastic. I think it's a great jumping off point into his work because again, it's short, but it's also very indicative of the kinds of hard fantasy or hard magic systems that Brandon Sanderson likes to write. So within the story, we follow a forger who is given the job of having to forge and recreate the soul of the emperor. He has died, but those that are around him want to keep up the facade that he is alive and bring him back to life in some manner. She knows that this magic is not allowed, it's forbidden, and honestly, the work that they're asking her to do is pretty much impossible, but we follow her as she's going through the steps of attempting to do this and at the same time trying to plan her own escape. And I think if you again want to learn what Brandon Sanderson does with his hard magic systems, I think this is a great one because a lot of this book is spent explaining the ins and outs of how forging works, how they stamp and create the false memories and all of that, and I thought it was super fascinating and I highly recommend this one. Again, I think it's a great place to start with Brandon Sanderson, and if you're already a fan and have not yet checked it out, I don't know why. I think this is definitely one of his best. And last, I want to talk about Yellow Sky Revolt, which is the first book in a new series. This is a historical piece that follows the events that have been romanticized in the tales of the Three Kingdoms. So this is a historical Chinese story that is based off of real events but has been told or embellished over time. If you are of Chinese heritage, I'm sure you are very familiar with this story, but for anyone who's not, basically there were different leaders that popped up in different parts of ancient China and were vying for control of the empire. And so that was turned into this very classic story that everyone knows. I found out about this story while watching the 2010 TV version, and I absolutely fell in love with it. So I was very excited when I was on Twitter and saw that there was an author who had written historical fiction based off of that original story. Now, this first story actually takes place before the events that start off with the TV show that I watched. So this almost read like a prequel to me, and I really loved it. It felt almost like a coming of age story of having the characters kind of grow into their roles and getting to see all the setup that was already kind of done when I started that series. So depending on what version of the story you've heard before, you're going to have different connection to this first one. But despite, again, not having seen fully those events before, I thought it was so approachable and the writing is beautiful. If you are not familiar with the Three Kingdoms series, I actually think this would be a great place to start rather than the translated books, because I've read those, but I'll be honest, the original translated works are a little bit dry if you haven't fallen in love with the other forms of media and narrative all around the story. So for me, I want to recommend this book to readers like myself that love a lot of historical fiction that melds with fantasy. So this book technically is not fantasy, although I would argue that there's a lot of mysticism surrounding Chinese ancient culture that brings a fantastical element to the story almost. But this is the kind of book that I would recommend to those of you that love the Dandelion Dynasty, She Who Became the Sun, and a lot of the Chinese inspired fantasy that I love, because again, it just reads like a fantasy book with very, very, very little magic because there's basically none. But the story is fantastic. The prose are beautiful. This, I believe, is an indie author, and the quality of this work will blow anyone's expectations away for those of you that have stigma around indie authors, because wow, this is more polished than a lot of the professionally or traditionally published books that I've read, and I'm dying to get to book 2. I know I have an e-copy of that, so I will be reading and reviewing that close to the review date, but I highly recommend catching up on this series. Again, if you're at all open to this genre, even for myself, I don't typically read and review historical fiction, but I felt like I begged for a review copy because I knew I would love this book, and I was absolutely right. This is definitely one of my early favorites of the year, and I would really love to see more of you picking it up, regardless of what genres you normally read. If you're just looking for a really high quality story with great characters, plot, and relationship development, I think that this one really has it all in this action-packed story with a lot of heart. So highly, highly recommend. Can I say that enough? For my BookTube shoutout, I want to talk about Bookpiled, and he is a BookTube creator that I think a lot of you already know and love. He pretty much predominantly only reviews science fiction, which is something that I really appreciate, and he has a style on camera that I think a lot of us love. He's a little bit more sparse and dry, and I mean that in the best possible way. I think so many of us really try to put like energy on camera and put on a bit of a personality, and he just feels very authentic and honest and is very, again, like honest in his reviews, which I love. He does some great top 10 and top 15 videos talking about his favorites. And if you love vintage science fiction, older books, and are a bit of a collector yourself, you will absolutely love his hauls and book reviews because he really focuses on those areas, more of the older books, while I admit I tend to read more of the new releases. So definitely go check him out if for some reason you have not yet. I adore his channel and I know that you will too. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out? And I'd love to hear, in terms of science fiction or fantasy, what is your favorite book you've read so far this year? I am so pleased to find so many favorites so early into the year. And despite being sick, I think I made it through this video all right. So if you're still around, please give me a thumbs up as appreciation. If you're new here, I do read a lot of science fiction, fantasy, horror thrillers, and true crime. So if you like to, you can definitely subscribe. If you want to drop a comment, how about a little sick person in sympathy or a stack of books? That always works. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.